sort of follow up or a part two, in a sense, to the last video I made on Russia Today. Um, I've been in a bit of back and forth with RT zealots. I call them because these are people who, in my opinion, have tunnel vision. They're not really interested in even trying to contemplate that RT is flawed. And I noticed that the sort of refute that they tend to take, it's sort of predictable. So if you criticise RT, their immediate response is, "Oh, what about the BBC? What about CNN? Or the US government done this at this time?" This is a pathetic response because it's just deflecting, trying to change the subject. Now, none of my posts on the RT page was I in any way intending to defend the BBC or CNN or the American government. Now, anyone who's followed my channel for a while will know that I have made critical videos about CNN, about the BBC, and there's many things I can talk about the US government. The only reason I don't talk more about the US government is because I feel it's already well documented. I feel I wouldn't really be adding much. I try to talk about things that I believe are not spoken about enough. So I believe RT does need to be challenged a lot more. Um, America's record is well documented. I don't need to go over that. People know about Vietnam, they know about America's foreign policy blunders and immoral judgments, all the rest of it. So, I could talk about that, but I don't think it would be anything original. So that's why I talk about RT. But to get to the contemporary issue here, Syria. Um, Unfortunately, I think that armed conflict, is perhaps one of the most divisive of all subjects, possibly the most divisive um, global subject, more so than any other, more than trade issues, more than cultural differences. I think war divides and polarizes opinion so much because war is brutal, and when you get a war like that, which is happening in Syria, it's now become deeply complex. People respond emotionally to what they're seeing, and if they have a preset viewpoint, they're always going to respond emotionally to whatever that viewpoint is. So, if people have convinced themselves that the Assad regime is democratically elected, and I'll respond to that in a second, but if they've convinced themselves of that and it's just an embattled government fighting off terrorists and Russia's the great savior, then they're going to passionately argue in favor of that. For those who are pro Islamist, they're going to passionately argue in favor of the Islamist cause. And then people like me passionately argue that actually both of those are problems. I believe both the Assad regime and the Islamist factions are problems. I find it utterly absurd that if you criticize Assad, that equates to being pro ISIS. That is such a nonsensical argument. I've known Syrians, not very well, but I've been in forums, I've met Syrians who absolutely detest Assad. They also detest ISIS and the various Islamist groups that are in the field. But the fact of the matter is, independent research has shown that more Syrian civilians have died at the hands of the Assad regime than at the hands of ISIS and other Islamist groups. This is independent research. This isn't like from the US State Department or anything like that. It's independent monitoring groups, and they're not exonerating the rebels or opposition to Assad, which, by the way, now is far from a clear cut picture. What I resent about this is that a lot of the people, especially those who follow RT, tend to present the Syria war as being black and white, as being the goodies versus the baddies. The reality is far more complex. In fact, I might well put that point on the RT page. Um, it's a very childish outlook, the goodies and the baddies. So in their tiny little minds, the goodies is the Assad government, the baddies is everyone who's fighting against the Assad government. And the thing is, it's very easy to believe that because ISIS is a disgusting, brutal organization. Everyone knows that, and most people agree with it. Um, But unfortunately, because Assad is a president, because of this perception that he has a democratic mandate, and I think that's a deeply flawed argument. People say, oh, 80% of Syrians support him. They're ignoring the fact that dictators, by their very nature, rule by fear and intimidation. That's how they keep in power. I've no doubt there are some Syrians who genuinely support Assad, but the same could be said of any dictator. There is that there is that perception that dictators have support. Um, it means nothing. If you were to do a poll in 1930s Germany, you'd probably find the majority of Germans support Hitler. It doesn't mean that that was the right path for the country. I personally think Assad is a disaster. He started this war, and the Islamists infiltrated it, and they've made it worse. But the victims are the Syrian people, and it just pisses me off that when anyone questions Assad, the immediate response is, "Oh, you support the Islamists." I hate Islamism, and I've been extremely outspoken about my thoughts on ISIS. I hope they're wiped off the face of the earth. But for the Syrian people, Assad is just as bad. If you happen to be in a rebel area and if you can't get out as a refugee with no help from Russia or the Gulf states, then then you're basically in a situation where you're slandered as a terrorist and you're killed or you're horribly maimed. And to think that there are people watching RT who think this is okay because they believe in the regime's propaganda, I find that abhorrent. Um, when I come out with these arguments, people portray me as being some sort of enthusiast for CNN or the BBC. When I look at what's happening in Syria, I'm not going by what the BBC or CNN says. I'm going by independent sources, or at least as independent as I can possibly find. It is true that it is very hard to get the absolute truth from what's happening in Syria, but anyone who thinks that the Assad regime is innocent, they're just kidding themselves. They're deluded. So, unfortunately, that is the nature of war. And this is a typical large scale war. It's creating very bitter opinions on both sides. That's why I don't post anything to do with this on my timeline on Facebook, because I know it would start arguments which I can't really be bothered with. But I do make videos about it because I think it's important. I'm not claiming I know everything, but I do know that RT is rotten to the core. RT has been exposed time and time again for being the mouthpiece that it is. And incidentally, anyone who is trying to make a comparison between John Kirby of the US State Department and RT, John Kirby's an individual. He's not that powerful. He's simply a spokesman for the American government. RT is an example of a media network that actually does wield very large power. And needless to say, journalists in Russia um, simply could not ask Putin the sort of questions that the American government does permit. Now, the American government has had corruption, it's had scandals, and various American governments have been embroiled in some very, very, very dubious foreign policy situations. Some of it's downright disgraceful. But like I said, that's already well documented. I just don't think it's necessary to go over that just to prove a point. So yeah, the point of this video is just say that people need to try and think objectively, and not that their preset view of something dictate their outlook on this. I think the most practical approach to looking at Syria is what it is, a complex situation. If you think Syria is black and white, you haven't been paying attention.